Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker, Dr. John C. Mohawk.
I'd like to begin this by having an explanation a little bit about what the Americas were in 1491 and before that. Just a few thoughts about that. And that I think it's important for people to sort of grasp this idea, which is that for a very long time, specific Indian peoples occupied areas of North America, and that when they occupied these areas as nations. And when they occupied them, there was no question about whose law was on that land or whose customs were there. For all that time, Indian nations interacted with one another, and Indian nations built up their own versions of culture, and they pretty much made their own laws and had their own way of doing things. So you can say that of the long history of North America since probably the Ice Ages, that independent, distinct nations of Indian people existed in North America, among which, of course, are the ones locally. And so there's no question that they were sovereign nations, that they had the right, and in fact did, make war and peace, and that they lived this way for a really long time. So it wasn't as if there was anything new going on in the area of sovereignty or jurisdiction or any of those things that we think of today when it comes to what it is to be a nation. And in the beginning, the earliest European contacts with Indian nations, the European nations treated with the Indian nations as nations. There was no conversation in the 1610s, 20s, 30s, 40s about whether or not they were dealing with nations. The protocols were nation to nation, the rhetoric was nation to nation. The Indian nations fit perfectly the European version of what a nation is. And so there was a nation-to-nation relationship, was the very first relationships between native North American nations and European nations. The Americas, we will remember at first, were an unexpected revelation. Whatever else we ought to say about the Christopher Columbus voyages, and whoever was first and whoever did this or that, the awareness of occupied lands to the west becomes widespread when Columbus reports that he found land and he found people in 1492. And upon that discovery, there kicks into motion a series of issues and questions, and the most important of those ones were, who are these people that they have encountered? There was no piece of European knowledge that could locate and identify who the people were and who the lands were. And in fact, it was going to start a huge crisis in confidence. Europe's culture explained to itself that it had divine authorities based on the idea that they had all the information and knowledge that the supernatural had intended them to have. And to find a place that was not in the Bible was a crisis. They had to know where it was. You might not think that that was a huge thing, but in a way it's one of the things that sets forth one of the great evolutions in European culture, which is the Protestant movement, which was to question whether they had been given the proper information, because it didn't seem as if the omission of a couple of continents, along with hundreds of people, was a possibility. The next thing that happened was, once they started encountering people, reports started going back to Europe of how the people that they had encountered were really quite different from Europeans. Now, this conversation accelerates a lot starting in the early parts of the 17th century. It was already happening a little bit, but it accelerates because there's really a curiosity here. People are starting to report that they're encountering societies that don't have the hierarchy and don't have the customs of any sort that were common in Europe. Europe's theory of society required that people be, you have to say, subjected to a considerable amount of coercion in order to be able to be a viable society. And then they came to North America, and people started reporting that they had encountered societies that had no apparatus of state coercion. Indeed, that had no hierarchy of government, or very little hierarchy of government as people knew it. So I'm saying that Europeans came from a place where the military requirements of their society had created an extremely hierarchical government, almost, you might say, in those fiefdoms, which were small ones, but in the microcosm of the fiefdom, you had what amounted to small military dictatorships there, and stratified society. You had a ruling group, and then you had a group that did all the work. There wasn't much in between that. There was a class of people who belonged to the priesthood or the church generally, but in any given small unit, that was small and often non-existent on a small unit. And so the norm in the European society would have been this society where people expected a great deal of direction from some authoritative figure. Then they came to North America, and people started reporting that there were whole societies that didn't have any authoritative figures. And this set in motion a bunch of questions.